Pastor John here, Dependent Baptist Church, Inman, South Carolina. We're here trying to figure out what the will of God is for our lives. I am so blessed you've decided to join us today. I welcome you to another episode of Truth That Changes Things. How can I know the will of God for my life? Well, the last podcast began with an introduction to this topic. I was basically trying to get folk to the point where they could see that God really does have a will for our lives. Number two, that God does care what we do. And number three, God has the right to expect us to fulfill the reason for which He created us. Now we begin the process of trying to figure out what that will is. I do find it necessary at the outset here to say, though, the study is to help us find out what the will of God is for our lives, but we have to understand there are people out there with some very unique circumstances. And to help them find God's will for their life would take specific counsel after hearing specific details about their situation. We're going to try to cover a multitude of circumstances, but you have to know we can't cover them all. It would be pretty easy to get into the woods here a little bit by addressing these things, but we will stay on topic. So we begin with a question. Where are you at in the process of knowing what God's will is? If you want to know where you're at in the process, let me stir your thinking by presenting at least three possible places you could find yourself. Number one would be this. You really have no idea why God created you, and therefore you have no direction with which to aim your life. You know, it's pretty hard to let go of an arrow with any kind of success if you have no idea where the target is. In other words, you have no general direction. You're standing in front of 100 different doors, and each door leads to somewhere completely different. You're kind of paralyzed because you're not sure which door you're supposed to walk through. You don't know if God wants you in the medical field or the scientific field. You're not sure if you're supposed to be in finances, construction, ministry, so on and so forth. At this point, the details of God's will are irrelevant because you don't have a grasp on the overall direction first. Now, this is usually where a young person would find themselves. Why is that? Because they're at the beginning of things. They are standing at the beginning of their life, and they need that direction. As my children grow into young adults, I really never ask them what they want to be when they grow up, but I ask them, what does God want them to be? It's my intention to direct them to God because I know He has a will for their life, and I know they will be the happiest when they find it. This position of finding God's will is not limited to young people, though. This is also a place where an adult of some years and experience can find themselves as well. They've really never sought the will of God, and therefore, even in middle age, don't know where they should be or what they should be doing. If we don't ask God for His direction, we may end up doing something we were never created to do. And when this happens, we may end up hating what it is we do, and we just simply will not find fulfillment in it. Instead of doing what we were created to do, we might actually end up doing something that's just convenient or available. Well, this happens in the workplace, doesn't it? Instead of knowing why you were created and looking for work in that field, you just take what's available and then wonder why you're not feeling fulfilled in it. You know, this happens in marriage too. And possibly not marrying the person that God intended, but going with the few options that you have and then only regretting it later. You know, it happens in finances. Not seeking God's will in the purchase and buying anyway, only to regret it later. Knowing God's overall direction for our lives is vitally important. You ask me why? Because if we find ourselves doing something we were not created to do, it will have a tendency to breed frustration in us. It's like trying to use a claw hammer as a letter opener. It just doesn't fit. This will be our experience too. If we were created for one thing and find ourselves doing something else, have you ever heard a person make a statement like this? I hate my job. It's work to go to work. I can't seem to find any fulfillment in life. Life holds no meaning for me. I'm just living for the weekend. It's the only time I can really be happy. I heard a person say this one time, I live for vacations. I believe it has everything to do with knowing God's will for your life and then doing it. Well, the second position that a person can find themselves is if you have a pretty good idea of the general direction, but the details are what you're missing. You know God wants you to be in things like construction, ministry, plumbing, maybe medical, or even being a housewife. The part you're not sure about is when, where, or how you're supposed to do what God wants for your life. Early on in my Christian experience, I knew God wanted me to be a preacher. What I didn't know was things like where He wanted me to be a preacher, when He wanted me to be there, and how I was going to get to that point. I needed the details. Is this where you're at? You need God to give you the details. You need the when, the where, and the how. Well, I believe that we can help you with this. Well, the third position a person could find themselves is, and this is the most desirable, you not only know what God created you to do, but you are experiencing the fulfillment that comes with actually doing it. I truly hope that this is where everyone is right now, but if you're not, then you're the person that I truly want to engage with. So, how do we do it? How do we find God's will for our lives? It all starts with, number one, having the right frame of mind. Of course, we're talking about thinking properly as we approach this topic. If we're not thinking properly, it really won't matter what practical steps we take in finding God's will. We will come up short in achieving our goals. So what does having the right frame of mind include? It includes, number one, a passion for knowing His will in the first place. Now, I emphasize the word passion. Why is this? Because finding out what the will of God is at times will present challenges that would otherwise discourage us from wanting to know in the first place. Without a real passion for knowing God's will, we might give up before being blessed with finding out what it is. We must be so convinced that we cannot live and live happily without knowing what God wants for our lives, that if we don't know what it is, life holds no true meaning. As we go along in this study, we'll definitely be confronted with things that will challenge your passion in order to follow through and find out what God's will is. So we need a passion for the search. Number two, we need openness. What am I saying? We need to be absolutely open to every possible avenue that God could lead us. If there's a single direction that you would not be willing to walk down if God led you, then knowing God's specific will becomes difficult at best to ascertain. I mentioned before about standing in front of 100 different doors. No doubt there's going to be doors that are more desirable than others, but you must be open to every door God leads you to. A scriptural example of this would be Isaiah 6, verse 8 and 9. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me." He said, "Go, tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, see ye indeed, but perceive not." Notice God simply asked in a general way, who would volunteer to go where I send them? When Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me," he displayed an openness to every way that God would lead. Isaiah didn't pick and choose what he was willing to do, nor did he have a list of things that he really wanted to stay away from. After Isaiah surrendered himself to whatever God wanted, that's when God got specific with him. There was a time in my life that I felt God wanted me to pastor, but I hadn't gotten a peace about it. I remember being in a missions conference and thinking the last thing I want to do is be called of God to go to Africa and live in a grass hut. I just wasn't open to it. But God worked in me, and I finally had to go to the altar and surrender to whatever God wanted, if that meant going to Africa and living in a grass hut. But as a result, God confirmed in my heart that I was to be a stateside pastor through it. I did not get the direction until I became open to every road that God could lead me down. So the mindset that we have to have is passion, openness, and, number three, the right motivation for knowing. What would the right motivation be? That you could not live the life that glorifies God to the greatest extent without knowing and doing what His will determines. How do we do this? You have to empty yourself of any self-ambition. There cannot be any part of you that desires something selfish. You cannot have a secret desire to do things like be rich or be famous or to consume anything upon your own lust. If we go into seeking God's will with any self-ambition, we will not get a true sense of what He wants for us. So we need passion, we need openness, we need motivation. The last thing we need is patience. Oh boy, I've done it now. This has always been something hard for me to do. This is an essential part of the process though, because God doesn't work on our timetable, He works on His own. God has millions of chess pieces moving all over the board at the same time, and He knows where we need to be, when we need to be there. If we step ahead or fall behind, truly we miss the purpose of our creation. We miss the blessing of what could have been. Patience is needed for things like waiting for God to reveal His will, waiting for the timing of our move, things like that. It is God's will that I pastor the church I'm in right now. But there was much to be done in the way of His will and revealing that will to a very large group of people. God had to work in my heart. God had to work in the heart of the previous pastor for when it was time for him to step down. God had to work in the heart of the people of this church to be willing to accept someone new. Then there's the timing of it all. If I would have had my way, I guarantee you, it would have been done 6 months sooner than it was. But God's timing is perfect. What I needed was patience. Hopefully I haven't deterred you from wanting to seek God's will for your life. There's certainly plenty of obstacles. In the next episode, we're going to move from the mindset to the practical steps for seeking His will. So, until next time, may the Lord lead you to truth that will free you.